following business process flows will be covered in this course. So as I said before, we'll start with onboarding the suppliers, wherein we'll identify the strategic suppliers, we'll run through the qualification cycle, and we will then have those suppliers approved in the system, which will finally create the supplier profile in Oracle. So during this time, we will look at the modules such as Oracle Supplier Lifecycle Management, Strategic Sourcing, and Procurement Contracts module for these processes. We'll finally move on further once the suppliers have been approved, the profile got created in Oracle, to raising a requisition in iProcurement module. Now the requisition that we'll be raising is for a number of contracts. For instance, a requisition to be raised requiring contingent workers. In Oracle, independent contractors is also called as contingent workers, or they're also synonyms with like temporary laborers. Alright. We'll also raise requisitions for time and material based labor contracts. We will raise requisitions for fixed price based temporary labor contract. We'll raise requisitions for fixed price services for expenses reimbursement. And finally, we'll raise requisitions for non-catalog items. So we'll not only raise the requisition, but we'll also run through the further processes in terms of processing that requisitions. For instance, in case of contingent worker, the requisitions will be raised, and then I will show you how the selection of contingent workers can be done, and finally how they can be brought on board and can be registered in Oracle. Having said that, we will also define contingent workers and employees definition in HRMS. We'll also have an integration with Oracle time and labor modules and Oracle internet expenses module for their definition, so that they could submit the timesheet and expenses process, which we will also look at it in detail. Anyway, so the next process that comes after supplier comes on board and we have those requisitions, the next process is strategic sourcing. Because the suppliers are new in the buying organization, we don't have any contract for them at all. So that's where we need to do strategic sourcing so that the contract comes in place, and those contracts can then be used for raising purchase orders. So as a part of this strategic sourcing module, I will show you how one can make the sourcing teams, how negotiation can happen, how RFQs are raised online on the systems, how the RFQs are approved, published to the supplier, supplier supplies through the way of quotations, and finally how an analysis can be done on those quotations, and finally an award to the suppliers. So once we have an award or nothing but the contract in place, that's where the purchasing process will start. So once the purchasing process starts, that's where the communication comes into picture of communicating the purchase orders or contracts to the suppliers, and that's where a number of other modules comes into picture, such as iSupplier portal, wherein we will do the supplier collaboration online. And we'll take an example of, say, services contract for providing specialized consulting services. So as soon as the supplier reaches a specific milestone, then he will submit a work confirmation through iSupplier portal, which will be received and approved in purchasing, and finally once it's approved, then an invoice is raised and paid to the supplier. So there are multiple processes that are involved as a part of this. What I've written out here is just a summary of the complete business process flow. So in terms of the contingent workers, as I was saying before, we will need to define those contingent workers in HRMS in integration with the systems administrator module to have their users in place and assign the responsibilities. So once we have all those things in place, then we will use Oracle time and labor for contingent worker timesheet submission, and then we will see how those timesheets can be approved in Oracle time and labor modules, and finally once they're approved, then how it is converted to invoices, and the invoices are paid to the suppliers. As a part of contingent worker process flow, we will also see how contingent workers can submit their expenses online and how they get approved online, and how these expenses, once it's approved, gets audited by the expense teams or the payables team before generating an invoice and making a payment to the suppliers. So in this case, the supplier is the one, in layman's words, I would say this is like an agency who is providing the independent contractors, and the agency directly pays to the contractor based on the contract signed between the agency and the contractor. We'll also see how employees can submit the timesheets and expenses online as a part of the business scenario that we'll be looking into, and how they can get the timesheets and expenses approved, and how they will be paid for the expenses that gets approved. Finally, once the invoicing and payment gets over, we'll generate the accounting, have an integration with subledger accounting, general ledger, and we'll see how accounting flows in these modules. Finally, getting into general ledger and how the journals gets created and posted in general ledger module. Now, as part of this complete process flow, we will also see process flow around catalog and non-catalog items, wherein we will bring fixed assets into picture and process those fixed assets, and finally transfer those fixed assets from payables to fixed assets module, so that further asset lifecycle can be taken up. As part of the asset lifecycle, the assets are further depreciated or recapitalized or finally retired, and then those accounting entries are posted to the GL. So all along, this course will be an extremely interesting course covering all aspects of the supplier management, strategic sourcing, contracting, fulfillment, supplier collaboration, invoicing, and payables to the suppliers. In the next movie, what I'm going to do is I will actually demonstrate you the business scenario that we will take as a part of this course, and you will find it's so interesting that it's nothing but a replication of a real world business scenario.